Thank you for watching Conscious Consumer Network. The live stream broadcast is free to view. You can pause and rewind live broadcasts to catch up, or view shows at a later date by accessing our free archives of all shows. Check out our broadcast guide to see what's on. You can show your support by donating to our network support fund. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the monthly newsletter for updates. We thank you for supporting free and independent media. Good evening, everybody. My name is Merwe, coming to you live here from Conscious Consumer Network headquarters in The Hague. It's good to be with you all again for another episode of Stop South African Genocide. With me tonight is my co-host, Karin Smith, and it's great to have you with us, Karin. Thank you ever so much.
Always wonderful to be here, Mel, and thank you for giving us this platform.
Yes, well, it's wonderful to work with people who are so dedicated to this cause, and we are actually looking for Schalk and Merwe to join us. He was scheduled and posted and advertised to join us this evening, but he's having some problem dialing in, which is why we've started the show late. So apologies to everybody who is listening and who's been waiting for us, but we will continue. And I'm sure we have a lot to talk about, and hopefully Schalk will be able to get into the meeting at some stage. Do bear in mind that South Africa is still Africa, and there are problems with net and bandwidth. But I believe they're getting fiber optic nowadays. Okay, so where to start off with tonight? I do want to say, first off, Karin, before we get started, let's talk a little bit about, we didn't get too much detail last week about the work you're doing and where people can find your information and how they can contribute to helping out with your particular angle into the situation disaster in South Africa.
Okay, well, as I said last week, it is not for me to judge whether to stay or leave South Africa. I feel that that is everybody's own decision to make. However, if you want to leave and are able to get an American visa, I collect donations in order to help people to pay for the visa, pay for their airfare, and help support them when they get here. Because the asylum process is a very long, hard, expensive process. The lawyer can cost you $10,000, just the lawyer. And in the meantime, before you get your hearing, you have no green card, you have no social security number, so you can't work. And you have to support yourself until you can get your hearing. Then at the hearing, they may give you a yes or a no, but that after your hearing, that could take a couple of years as well for them to give you an answer. In that time, you have a temporary green card, you have a social security number, you can work, but you have to renew it every single year, and that costs you $680 per person in your family to renew it. You can also get a driver's license, but that's also only valid for that year until you renew your card. So it's a very long, drawn-out, expensive business, and people really struggle to survive while they're waiting on the thing to happen. So I collect funds for them, and my website is radiofreesouthafrica.com, and there is a donate button on there, and that money helps people to come to the US and to maintain some kind of lifestyle and pay their lawyers to get a visa and a work permit to stay here. There's no guarantees, however. We have had some successes. I have a wonderful lawyer, a lady lawyer in Iowa who knows about the South African situation, so you don't have to pay her by the hour to teach her about South Africa, and then she'll put in your information for you. She has had some success, but an equal number of failures. It just depends on the person from Immigration Services that does your hearing, whether you get a yes or a no out of them. There's no hard and fast rules about it. It just depends how they feel that day. So it's a very hit and miss affair, but we have had some successes, which thank you, Lord, is all I can say. One of my asylee families went for their hearing 2 weeks ago, and I raised the entire funds for them to go to the hearing, to pay for their lawyer, And now I'm helping them survive until they get a yes or a no. But they are waiting for their green cards, which means they can start working if they can find work. And I have found that South Africans are marvelous. They will put their hand to anything. The wife in this case is cleaning houses. And the husband is just doing anything he can turn his hand to. So he's kind of a day worker and getting paid daily. So South Africans really will do anything that's required. And you will hear in the United States as well, we need the illegal Mexicans because they do the work that Americans won't do. It's not true. It is not true. If you're really desperate for a job, you will do anything that you are able to do. And I will say this, I have, as I said, 5 South African families who have applied for asylum. They work like dogs and they don't care what they're doing because they are so grateful to be out of that country. Now, for the people who do want to stay there, well, good for them. I don't see much of a future barring some kind of miracle for them, but I do see their point of view and I understand why they refuse to leave. And there are many people who we're going to have on this show in the next weeks and months who will give them an alternative, their alternative thought to leaving the country. For instance, the Cape Party, Jack Miller from the Cape Party will be on in a couple of weeks and he will tell you what their dream is for South Africa, and that is for the Cape to become an Afrikaner territory and be white only, etc., etc. Self-determination is their goal. So he will be able to tell you the entire story behind that. There is hope for South Africans to stay in the country. But given the state of the country and the worsening of it by the hour, never mind by the day anymore, it's getting worse by the hour. They burnt down the Bloemfontein City Hall the other day, which has hundreds of years of history behind it. They burnt down another one in the Cape last night. It's just, it seems to me a very hopeless cause to try and live in your own country right now. And I hate saying that, but I've been following this for 10 years or more, and that's how it looks to me, as if there is no hope for them. I don't see it, Mel, but I back them. I understand why they don't want to leave, but I fear for them.
Yeah. Yes, it's a very tough decision. And, you know, I'm one of those people who did the surreptitious exodus, and I can tell you it's never been a decision that sat well with me. I've always wanted to go back. I've had suffered from terrible homesickness for 2 decades now, and it doesn't get any easier, and you always wish that you had had more time to spend with family who has now passed on. And you know, there is a lot of regret, remorse, and obviously heartache from being, you know, forcefully pulled from your motherland in a way that's unnatural. You know, it's not necessarily something you'd want to do if circumstances were all pleasing. But I do want to touch on something you've spoken about there, Karin, perhaps an interesting point to kind of unpack at this juncture, because it brings up some interesting historical notes, which I think there's a lot of confusion around. You mentioned potentially, you know, turning, say, the Cape into an all-white territory, and this whole idea of separatism, and which really is rooted in the whole concept of separate development. And I want to clear a few things up here, because people identify the concept of separate development as the suppression of Black people and the stripping of their rights, when actually the concept of separate development, which was developed and propagated by Verwoerd, and actually Nelson Mandela's cousin, Doliwanga Matanzima, who was the premier of the Transkei, was very much pro the concept of separate development. That means Nelson Mandela's own family were pro-apartheid. This is very controversial to say, because separate development became spun as apartheid. This word was, you know, made this international buzzword of hatred and shame towards white people. But really, to understand the concept of separate development was not about the suppression of Black people and the stripping of their rights. Rather, it was about their preservation of their cultural heritage, not forcing them to speak the white man's language by giving them their own self-run territories and states with their own governments, their own judiciaries, their own infrastructure, and the ability to learn and be educated in their own languages. This in a stark contrast to a time when the colonial empires such as Canada and Australia were forcefully taking native children and indoctrinating them out of their cultural heritage, teaching them the white man's language and punishing them if they spoke their own language. Here we had in the 60s something that was quite the opposite, where we had the native people being respected, bearing in mind that a census in the 1960s in Australia didn't even recognize Aborigines as people. They were counted as fauna and flora, not lower than animals. They were counted as plant life. Here we had in South Africa, in stark contrast to that, okay, that sort of social culture at the time, where we were actually starting to recognize that the white people of Africa are a flower, the black people of Africa are a flower. They are different flowers, both deserving of the space to grow and flourish, but we should not try to change each other's cultures. Rather, we should preserve and protect each other's cultures. So the opposite of cultural genocide is what separate development was all about. Yet, the separative development was very much seen by the outside powers who controlled South Africa's central banks as a threat. Because what it did was it took vast tracts of land and a huge amounts of the black population and stuck them outside official controls of the New World Order controlling parties, because they didn't have to pay back loans to the outside parties, the IMF, the World Bank. They were getting loans and subsidies from South Africa. They weren't subject to taxation by outside countries. They were completely protected and surrounded by this mammoth country that is now South Africa. And they were also thus protected from the corruption and manipulations of outside people. For Wut wanted these people to develop without having to be in huge debt to the outside world. And because of that, he was assassinated. 2 attempts. Well, the first attempt failed. It just pierced his cheek and ear. But the second one, they got him. Okay. The guy that actually stabbed him said it was a worm inside of him, which really sounds like possession.
Yes, yes. But what you're talking about right there, there was a book published in 1988, a German book published. And I'd like to just tell you some of the things about apartheid that the world does not know. So in 1988, a German book published how the white giant of Africa actually was. In 1972, SA blacks owned 360,000 vehicles, more than all the black African states together. The monthly income of blacks per capita in 1988 was 352 Rand a month. Malawi and Mozambique earned less than 20 Rand a month. In 1988, black people could undergo a complicated heart valve surgery for just more than $1, while black Americans had to pay $15,000. In a Pretoria hospital, between 2,000 and 3,000 of these surgeries were done per year. In 1970, black workers earned 1,751 million, or 25% of the total wage fees in South Africa, and increased to 17,238 million in 1984, 1,000% growth in 14 years, and 32% of total wages in South Africa. Between 1962 and 1972, the UN paid 298 million to underdeveloped countries, compared to South Africa that spent 558 million on the development of its black areas. The budget amount for black education increases every year from 1970 to almost 30% more than any other government department. So much for us refusing them access to education. From 1955 to 1984, the number of black scholars increased from 35,000 to 1,096,000. 71% of the black population could read and write versus 47% in Kenya, 38% in Egypt, and 34% in Nigeria. On average, during that year, 15 new classrooms per working day were built for Black scholars. In 1985, there were 42,000 Black students enrolled at SA universities. And where do people really think that Nelson Mandela got his law degree? It was in this terrible white apartheid education system that didn't educate Blacks, according to the world. There were 5 Black universities and 28 higher education institutions funded by the government. Soweto, with its population of 1.2 million, had 5 modern stadiums versus Pretoria, with its 600,000 whites, who had 3. Soweto had 365 schools versus Pretoria, 229. In Soweto, there were 115 football fields, 3 rugby fields, 4 athletic tracks, 11 cricket fields, 2 golf courses, 47 tennis courts, 7 swimming pools, 5 bowling halls, 81 basketball fields, and 39 children's playgrounds, and countless community halls, cinemas, and clubhouses. In Soweto in 1978, there were 300 churches, 365 schools, 2 technikons, 8 clinics, 63 kindergartens, 11 post offices, and its own fruit and vegetable market. The white government built a huge hospital, Baragwanath, with 3,000 beds in Soweto, one of the largest and most modern hospitals in the world. And I might add that that was a very, very popular hospital for doctors from all over the world to come and do their residency because they studied things there that they would find nowhere else. Today, it is an absolute wreck. I read this morning that if you go to Baragwanath, you must take your own bed, your own mattress, your own sheets, your own food, and your own medications. And even then, they will have you sleeping on the floor in the corridor. 21 operating theatres were equipped with the best equipment money can buy. Here, Blacks were treated at a nominal cost of 2 rand for an unlimited period. In 1982, no fewer than 898 heart surgeries were done there at $2 rand per throat. Next to the Baragwanath Hospital is the St. John Eye Clinic, famous for the treatment of glaucoma, previous fixed retinas, traumatic eye injuries, and rare tropical diseases. There were over 2,300 registered firms, 1,000 taxi operators, and 50,000 car owners in Soweto. Dr. Kenneth Walker, a Canadian physician, visited Soweto and made the following observations. He saw several houses worth more than 100,000 rand, with various BMWs at the door. Only 2% of homes were shacks with neat buildings with lawns. If he had to choose between the decaying apartments in New York, Detroit, or Chicago, then he would rather stay in Soweto. He'd rather be ill in Soweto than in some Canadian cities. He said the city had more schools, churches, cars, taxis, and sport fields than any other independent African state. In 1978, the South African government built a highly modern hospital, Medunsa, on the border of the independent state of Botswana at a cost of 70 million on 35 hectares. In this city, there were living and sleeping facilities for male and female students. Black doctors, dentists, veterinarians, and paramedical staff were trained. It's the only specialized university of its kind in Africa and one of the few in the world financed by white taxpayers exclusively to benefit Blacks. Almost all students who mainly came from the national homeland's costs were taken care of by the government. The practical training took place in the nearby Karin Hospital, where the whole range of human ailments is covered. Karin had the facilities for kidney transplants, isotope units with specialized laboratories where 200 doctors were trained practically every year. South Africa provided training for the airline personnel of Swaziland, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zaire, and the Comores. In 1979, when the train traffic to the Malawian capital of Lilongwe was interrupted by rebels, South Africa sent transport aircrafts with fuel drums to keep the economy going. And this is in a time when we had sanctions against us and couldn't get fuel. In 1986, 80,000 black businessmen from Africa visited Cape Town to finalize business deals. South Africa provided the grain needs of its neighboring countries and wider. In 1980, Zambia received 250,000 tons of maize, Mozambique 150,000 tons and 50,000 tons of wheat, Kenya 128,000 tons of maize, and Zimbabwe 100,000 tons. Other countries that also received South African grain were Angola, Ivory Coast, Malawi, Mauritius, Tanzania, and Zaire. At least 12 countries of Africa, according to the Argus African News Service, were so dependent on South African grain, hang on a minute, that a total ban on imports and exports would have destroyed them economically. About half of Lesotho's male population worked in South Africa, about 146,000 in 1983, and earned 280.6 million, which was about half of Lesotho's treasury. In the 1982-83 financial year, SA budgeted 434 million for assistance to the independent neighboring states. South Africa produced more electric energy than Italy, as much crude steel as France, more wheat than Canada, more wool than the US, more wine than Greece, and more fish than Great Britain. South African trains ran on more rail lines than in West Germany, carried more passengers than Switzerland, have better punctuality record than Austria, and exported car parts to 100 countries. South African mines bore down to the depth of 3,480 meters and hold the record for the deepest vertical shaft at 2,498 meters deep into the hardest rock in the world. We were accused by the world that we were a police state. In South Africa, 1.4 officers for every 1,000 people, while the world was as follows: UK 2.2, Israel 3.5, New York 4.3, and Moscow 10 per 1,000. In South Africa, there were 16,292 white policemen versus 19,177 non-white. We were accused of killing our political offenders. In 1979 to 1980, there were no deaths in South African prisons. In the previous 10 years, 37 died versus 274 in the same period in Wales and England. We were accused that we paid starvation wages. In 1974, the average monthly income of black workers in South Africa was $127 versus the $140 in the US, the richest country in the world. We were accused that we locked up thousands of political prisoners. In 1983, 127 such prisoners were confined in South Africa, and 11 whose movements were limited. A further 32 were under house arrest. Our country, the treasure of the world, was stolen. Think again before you call yourself a loyal supporter of the devastating new South Africa. And that is just a portion of the lies that are told and believed by the world about the dreaded hatred, apartheid regime, which, as you so clearly said, was a separation. We were separating people into their own cultures, their own way of living, ruled by their own chiefs, ruled by their own laws, which could not apply to us because we could never live under that. And yet we have been forced to live under it today without the benefit of any doubt from the rest of the world. And those figures, Mel, they are devastating. They speak for themselves, and they were written by a German who is not a South African. So it's not white propaganda.
Yeah, very, very, very sad state of affairs. And, as we keep saying, when you actually look at the country that South Africa is and how rich it is in resources, to be in the state that it is in, you must know it has been abused and plundered. And this has not been done without the help of the mainstream media manipulation machine. And particularly noted when you look at words like apartheid. This is a brilliant sort of example of how neurolinguistic programming is used. They come out with buzzwords like terrorist, apartheid, and they get the public to believe that if you are pro-apartheid, you are anti-freedom. They push that into the public psyche, and that if you are anti-apartheid, you must be pro-freedom, and that the whole concept of Nelson Mandela's liberation movement was done on the back of being supposedly pro-freedom, but South Africa is no more free today than it was back then. In fact, I think it's worse off now than it was back then. So the whole thing, you start to deconstruct it just in the most simplistic levels. It's a complete and utter lie. And you can see that when you read statistics such as that.
Yeah, absolutely, Mel. And I mean, since then, there are more race-based laws today under the ANC regime than there ever were under the hated apartheid regime. Every single thing. I have a professor in South Africa, because I don't believe that anyone has ever made a list of the race-based laws. We give a number, but where does the number come from? So I asked a professor in South Africa to please list them for me. He has been at it for over a year now. He says that every single law passed in South Africa has some racist undertones. So even laws preserving heritage sites have got a race-based foundation saying, except if they were white and if they Boer and then they can be destroyed. But if they black, and so the fact that we say 110, 119 race-based laws, it is probably over 1,000 in number if you put them all together. And one day I hope to have the list. But he has a full-time job. He's doing it out of a matter of interest. And now he says he is so horrified he doesn't want to continue because there's not a single law passed in South Africa that is not anti-white. So if the world was prepared to make such a fuss about apartheid and its racist views, why are they not prepared to even mention in a whisper what's going on today?
Yes.
Why?
Absolutely. And I do want to talk about the whole apartheid thing is still very entrenched in people's consciousness that, we were disrespectful to black people and they couldn't go to certain areas. There was whites only, white, when they went to the post office, there was queues for white people, there were queues for black people. And the analogy I use of this, I've had older friends of my family tell me this, that there were two queues. And because not a lot of black people can read and write, the queue for the black people was always shorter than the queue for the white people at the post office who were posting letters. And she would get annoyed because she wasn't allowed to stand in the shorter queue because she was white. So it works the other way around too.
Yeah.
And they were just like, back then thought that was absolutely ridiculous. So the extremes to which separation was taken eventually did cause social conflict for both sides. But I do want to talk about the whole concept of forceful race mixing because people don't seem to really understand this. And I do ask people to go do a bit of research on other colonial empires, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. It's very well documented, the stories of the Canadian Indian residential or boarding schools where these native Indian children were kidnapped from their tribes and then interred into these residential schools where they were then stripped of their cultural heritage, culturally genocided, had their language and their traditions taken away, forced into Christianity. And I mean, they had something like a 70% death rate in some of these schools. And some of these kids were given blankets with smallpox and made to sleep with sick children. And it really was a subversive, subtle genocide going on, if not cultural, then outright, as far as I'm concerned. And the number of kids who have survived these residential schools, because some of them are still running into the 90s and they've come forward. These are beautiful Indian people or native people who live in Canada and America, and I've heard their testimonies, and it's absolutely heartbreaking when you hear them talk about how they were punished in electric chairs and how some of them had snakes thrown at them in bathtubs, and just the most horrendous things these kids were subjected to. Now, that in stark contrast to, that is what I would consider forceful race mixing, where you take one race and you force the outlooks, the religions, the culture of another race onto them. Okay, and I'll just wait for you there, Karen. You're right there. When you take the race of, say, for example, the colonialists, yeah, they arrive and they suddenly arrive on this land where these people have been for many, many more generations, and then start to want to change the way they do things, okay, and the way they are, and the language they speak. Forceful race mixing, okay. That is the complete opposite extreme of what separate development was, which was the respect and preservation of native Bantu and black cultures. And I actually think we finally have Schalk, who's managed to come in. Schalk, is that you? Are you there?
Yes, finally, Val. Finally, I'm here.
Fantastic. Thank you for making it in. We do know it's sometimes troublesome coming in from South Africa. We really appreciate you sticking with us and getting in via phone. So good to have you with us.
Greetings,
Thank you
Schalk.
very much. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being with you.
Nice to speak with you again, Schalk.
Hi, Karin. How are you?
Well, I'm coughing myself to death, but otherwise I'm good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right, Schalk, now that I'm pronouncing it correctly, Schalk, that's a very Afrikaans name, and what a van der Merwe as well. I tell you, you don't get much more Afrikaans and boer than that.
No, you don't. No. We arrived in South Africa in 1667, 68. Nobody's exactly sure because there were two guys coming in at approximately the same time. So yeah, we've been here for more than 300 years.
Wow, fantastic. Okay, so tell us a little bit about yourself. We want to learn a bit more about your outlook on South Africa, but first a bit more about your history.
My own personal history. I'm a lawyer by profession. Yes, I was a prosecutor for many years. I practiced labor law for many years, in politics, in organized business, and so forth. A mixed bag. Through the years, I've always been on the activist side of things, driving the rights, especially of the white minority. I was also recently one of the founding members of the National Conservative Party, which is, I see it's described as a far-right party. We don't see ourselves as far-right. We only see ourselves as basically for the rights of the Afrikaner people in South Africa and all those that associate with us. So yeah, that's in short where I fit in.
Fantastic. And there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in South Africa at the moment. Both myself and Karin are people who've done the leaving of South Africa and kind of look back and see what's going on there. And we're both doing what we can in our own respects to try and raise awareness about the situation there. As someone who's in the situation in South Africa at the moment, what are you seeing around you?
Well, I'm seeing a total collapse of the whole system. You must remember that after the fall of the so-called fall of apartheid, what happened after that was for some time we were living in kind of a honeymoon situation in South Africa where everybody, I think, black and white, believed that everything will be fine and we will make it through. But unfortunately, many of our more so-called right-wing or good conservative people already saw the problem at that point in time. And as the honeymoon period came to an end and the economy started to slow down and the race relations became a problem again and all those things, we are now seeing not only the stagnation of the country. I think we even passed the point of stagnation. We were literally seeing the country falling apart. Roads are not kept. Infrastructure is not kept. Dams are not kept. There's no provision for water, for electricity, etc. The municipalities are mostly bankrupt. The provincial governments are mostly bankrupt. The national government is running at this point in time at a huge loss. We're carrying debt even faster than yourself under the Obama administration. So it's incredible how quickly the things have now started to simply fall apart.
Go on, Karin. Feel free to chime in.
Yeah, Schalk, we Mel and I had a long chat about how the series on South Africa should go, and you are our historian. Now, you've done this for me in the past, and I know that you have got an absolutely wonderful grasp on the history of South Africa. So we thought that you could start from the very beginning and correct some of the awful ideas that people have about South Africa and just make them interesting, because you always do. So if you'd like to start in 1652, that would be rather marvelous.
Let's do that. Let's start at the start. Yes, Karin, we must remember that the Cape of Good Hope, the so-called Cape of Good Hope, it's the furthest point south. Actually, it's Cape Agulhas, that's the furthest point south. But it was known at that point in time, we're speaking now 500 years back, it was basically known as the Cape of Good Hope because it was halfway between Europe and the journey around Africa to the East Indias. So for many years you found that the Portuguese and even the Spanish and the Dutch would land somewhere in what is today South Africa. They would take in new supplies and water and so forth, and then move on in their journey to the East Indias. Already in 1488 we had a Portuguese navigator Diaz. He came around the Cape. He was the first European then to around the Cape. Later on after him, I think it was in 1516, we had Vasco da Gama. He was another Portuguese seafarer that went all the way around the Cape to India. So you had all the traffic basically from the East Indias via the shipping routes to Europe. And then by the mid-1600s, the Dutch East India Company decided to establish a trading post or a halfway post on the Cape of Good Hope. And that's why they sent a merchant, and he was also then the commander at that point in time of the mission, a person by the name of Jan van Riebeeck. And they sent him basically to start a halfway station at the Cape of Good Hope, halfway between Europe and the East India. So that is where South Africa was born.
But his point was, his instructions were not to colonize the Cape.
No, there was no idea at that stage. Africa was barren. It was the dark continent. The Europeans didn't really thought of it as a place to colonize. You must remember that the era of colonization of Africa came only about 150 to 200 years after that. All that Jan van Riebeeck was supposed to have done is go and establish a halfway post at the Cape of Good Hope and build a little fort and basically run a trading post and a halfway post there for the ships passing. So that was his mission. It was not to colonize South Africa or anything for that matter.
And so what kind of habitation, what kind of people, what kind of inhabitants did they find when they landed there?
Yes, that's really interesting, Karin. People from Europe and America usually have this idea of white South Africans coming to Africa or South Africa and finding the whole place inhabited by black people. Now, what is a black person in Africa? Maybe it's a little bit different from what a black person is in America. In America, basically anybody of color to the skin, not of Native American origin, would be regarded as a black person. But in South Africa or Africa, black people are from a racial group that's called the Bantu people. And they originated far to the north in mid-Africa. Now, there's this perception that when whites came to South Africa in 1652, the whole place was inhabited by black people and white people started taking land from them. But that's simply not what happened. When the Dutch arrived at the Cape, and we have ample historic data surrounding that, official records, everything, it only shows that there were small numbers of nomadic people of the Khoisan race. Now they are small, yellowish people. They are the so-called original first people of South Africa. But they lived as nomadic people, hunter-gatherers, the Sun people mostly, and hunters, and people herders, the people who herded cattle and goats and so forth, the Khoi people, pastoral people basically. So they were living in small scattered nomadic groups all over the place. But it was not a densely populated area where black people per se, people of African or Negroid type of racial groups at that stage even lived. About 200 years on, you will find the first contact between the white colonists moving into the interior of South Africa and black colonists moving from the north. You will find on the Fish River, which is far to the east. If you look at the map of South Africa, it's far to the east. That was the first time that there was contact between black people or white people in South Africa.
So, Schalk, these people being nomadic, they didn't own land, they didn't settle for any length of time and grow crops, etc., did they?
No, they were nomadic. They were basically, you must remember something, when the Dutch arrived in South Africa, Europe was quite civilized. We went through the Greek Empire, and later on the Macedonian Empire, and the Roman Empire, and the Dark Ages, and the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance, and all those periods of development in Europe. But when the Europeans, the Dutch, came to the Cape, the people that they found there were literally living pre-Stone Age. There were no real use of metals, for instance. There wasn't even Bronze Age at that stage in South Africa. Much further to the north, you had some people smelting copper and gold, for instance. But the people living in what is today called South Africa, that area was basically inhabited by people of pre-Stone Age development. They didn't own land. There was no formal government. There was no occupation of land. There was not no cities for that instance. They lived in small hunter-gatherer groups, and they would move from place to place. And that is how they lived. So it's not this thing of a developed country in any way that Europeans came into 350 years ago.
Absolutely, Schalk. And they didn't have horses, donkeys. They hadn't invented the wheel, any of those things yet.
Nothing. Even if you compare the Africans, the Khoisan people, and I'm not in any way dishing them or being discriminatory against them. I'm simply stating fact. When you look at them, they weren't even at the developmental phase of, for instance, the Native Americans in North America. In Central America, you had these huge empires, and South America of the Incas and the Aztecs and these people and the Mayas. So don't for 1 minute think that any of that ever existed in South Africa. When we came here, it was basically people of pre-Stone Age development living scattered all over the place as nomads.
And so how did they interact with the first Dutch settlers?
Well, they traded. The first historic records is very clear. The Dutch bought sheep and goats and cattle and so forth from these people, which they had as I said, they were pastoral. So they traded with these people. There was no animosity. There was an incident where a Portuguese seafarer, I can't remember his name now vividly, there was an incident before 1652 where they came ashore, and there was a fallout with some of the Khoisan people living on the beach there, and it was a little battle and 60 people were killed. But for the most part...
Diego Kao or whatever, was that him?
Yes. Yes, I can't confirm. I can't remember the incident or the name of the commander. But the Dutch didn't come there as conquerors or even as settlers or colonists or anything. So there wouldn't have been any reason for them to pick a fight with the Khoisan people living on the beach or living in the interior. Because they wanted to trade with him. So there was no idea of extermination or anything like you had in Australia, where they hunted down the Aborigines and so forth. In North America, they literally hunted and genocided the Native Americans. That never happened in South Africa. In fact, the colored people in South Africa today is racially very close to those Khoisan people. They grew up as a racial group alongside the white people in South Africa. You will find that the colored people later on also started speaking Dutch, and later on even assisted and helped in what is called today Afrikaans. So they grew up as and they lived as a parallel racial group to the whites in South Africa. In later years, of course, there were squabbles between Khoisan people and some of the white colonists, and you would have had smaller wars and skirmishes and this forth. But it was never an organized genocide or anything like the propaganda is telling us today of white people coming in and wiping out the native population. That never happened. The people are still living in South Africa. They are still here. They are more in number than the white people, which tell you a story in itself. So you never had what you had, for instance, in Australia.
So then how did it come about that this small settlement that were just trading with passing ships and passing on mail from one ship to another, how did it come about that they then moved into South Africa?
I think it was a natural process in which people from all over the Dutch Empire and even Europe and from areas in Germany, you must remember now that at that stage that the Netherlands was part of a much greater empire, the Holy Roman Empire, in Europe, not particularly at that stage anymore, but they were regarded as part of the Greater Germany at that stage. So you had a natural influx of people to the Cape, mostly men. Later on, it's very interesting when you read the records of how they imported women into South Africa, because there were no women. It were mostly men coming to South Africa, and they came there and they settled around the fort. It was originally just a little fort that the Dutch built, and later on it was a castle. And they started settling all around this area, and gradually you had the Cape colony starting to evolve around that area, and they started moving over the mountains. And at one stage, they became what was known as free burgers, free citizens, free burgers. That was basically the start of the white population settling in South Africa. And from there on, through the years and through the decades, they started moving in gradually into the interior, what was called the trek boers. Trek simply meaning moving from one place to another. Trekking became a word in the English language, of course. They basically started to settle into the interior of South Africa, because it was basically a natural process of white colonists coming in and settling where they could farm and keep their cattle and so forth.
So, Schalk, the second wave of settlers was the French Huguenots, was it not?
Yes. You must remember there was a long time period in which the Cape, there was not so much a development of the Cape. For the reason that the Dutch didn't want a colony, because to have a colony you needed administrators, and it cost money, etc., etc. So they simply wanted a trading post and a halfway house. So you had a very long period during which there was a small influx of Dutch and German people into South Africa. And then by the end of the 17th century, in Europe, you had huge turmoil between the Catholics and the Protestants, religious wars breaking out and so forth. And then in 1685, if I remember correctly, 85 or 87, the Edict of Nantes was repealed in France, which basically took away the freedom of the Protestants in France, and a very large number of French Huguenots. Now, Huguenot is basically, it's a Protestant, it's a Calvinist Protestant, decided, well, they will move to the Netherlands. And when they came to the Netherlands, the authorities there told them, well, we can resettle you in South Africa, in the Cape Colony, and you had a large influx of French people at that stage moving into what was then the Cape of Good Hope.
And that's a very important point, because today the Afrikaner or the Boer descendants are very much Calvinistic in their religion. And I think that had a lot to do with it, with who and what they are today.
Yes. You must remember that the Dutch were Calvinist. And that was the reason why the French Huguenots firstly went to the Netherlands. So you had a very staunch religious setup and cult, if you want to call them, like the Puritans in the Americas. It's basically the same. Those people coming into South Africa and laying the foundation amongst the Afrikaner people of this very hardline, staunch, um, very, very tightly knit and close Calvinistic type of Protestant religion. And that is part of our history even until today. Now the last generation or two, like you find all over the world, has broken away in a large to a large extent from organized religion. But I still grew up in a very Calvinistic and conservative type of environment in religious terms. The generations prior to that were staunchly Calvinistic. The old Boers in the Boer republics, the state church, for instance, of the old ZAR, the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek, South African Republic, which is basically the Transvaal, the state church was a reformed church, a Calvinist reformed church. So yes, it is very much part of the character of the Afrikaner people, this adherence to Calvinism.
And so after a while, I know that the Dutch, when they landed there, were basically indentured servants, and they worked for the Dutch East India Company, and then later, when they had served out their indenturedness, they were given a piece of land, but they could only sell to the Dutch East India Company at prices set by the Dutch East India Company.
Yes, they were basically servants of the Dutch East India Company. That's correct. And that is also in later years where the free burghers, the free citizens came where they were given formal, in writing, formal freedom from the Dutch East India Company, and they could farm and live on their own. So yes, that's true. Yeah.
And so what essentially? I mean, they lived that way happily for 100 or so years. I mean, nobody thought of leaving the Cape until about 120 years later. What caused the exit from it?
Yes, it's very interesting. There was always, because you're sitting with many of the people coming to South Africa, to the Cape Colony, were mercenaries. They were soldiers. So they were tough soldiers coming from all over the world and settling there. So you would find, and sailors coming from the ships and so forth. So they were tough, hardened people living in South Africa. Afrikaners are still very hard-headed and pig-headed up till today. It's part of our character. So you would always have them complaining about the colonial, the first Dutch, and I will come to the English now, but the colonial authorities above them. And yes, as I said, gradually through the years, they started moving into the interior of South Africa. And then you must remember that during or around the 1800s, at that stage it's about 150 years after the Dutch came to South Africa. In Europe you had the Napoleonic Wars, and as part of Britain's conquest and dominance of the sea, the Royal Navy dominated the sea, and Napoleon's armies dominated the European mainland. The British came to the Cape, and they took the Cape not once, twice. They took it from the Dutch, and they established a British colonial rule here that was very, very unpopular, as you would imagine, with the Dutch people living in South Africa. It was basically foreigners taking over their government. It was nothing less than that. And it caused problems for the next 250 years, 200 years at least. Even up to today, there's still a divide between Afrikaans people and English-speaking people. Although it's much less than in earlier years, there's still a divide between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Karin, do you want to say something there? Okay. I grew up, I'm from a Boer family, then moved at a very young age from Johannesburg to Durban, where I suddenly was speaking mostly English. And there was one Afrikaans high school amongst 30 English-speaking schools. And we were very much aware of this dichotomy between, even in the white races, there seemed to be a separatism based on language and cultural origin between the British and the Afrikaners.
Yes, that's a fact, and you must remember that we're now speaking about the 1800s, the early 1800s, but the clashes between Afrikaans and English-speaking people at that stage, Dutch-speaking people and English speaking people, was from the start. I don't get the idea at that stage of um, it was not like a war between the two and these folks. But the English came as conquerors of the local people, and the local people were Dutch people. So they took it very, very hard on themselves. Especially the track boers that were fiercely independent. They didn't even want the Dutch authorities. Now a new authority under the English is coming in. The British are coming in. So you can imagine the amount of animosity even in those very early years. But then you must also remember that through the about the century and a half after that, you had this constant war between the Boer people, the Afrikaner people, and the English Empire, because the English Empire wanted South Africa and the Boers were living there. And later on the English Empire wanted the diamonds, and later on they wanted the gold, and later on they wanted the land, and that belonged to the Boers. So there was always this huge racial struggle between the empire, the British Empire, and the Dutch colonists that later on became the Afrikaners, the Boer people. Let me just pause there. There's some controversy of what is an Afrikaner and a Boer. I'm one of those people that believe it's very superficial. If you speak Afrikaans and your origins are mostly German, Dutch, and French, I will call you either Afrikaner or Boer. For me, there's not a major difference between the two. But the long and the short is, even for about a century and a half, there was always this animosity. And then, of course, in 1899, first there were two Boer wars. The first one were when the British conquered the old Republic of the Transvaal. That was in 1880 to 1881. The Boers won the independence back from Britain, and they re-established the republic. And then in 1899 until 1902, there was a second Boer War where the Free State, the Orange Free State Republic and the Transvaal Republic, the South Afrikaanse Republic, once again lost their independence to Britain. And that was a very cruel and a very harsh war against the Boer people, the Afrikaner people. They were genocided to a very large extent. Concentration camps. You always had this idea of concentration camps being invented by the Germans in the Second World War, but it was preceded by the British in South Africa by 50 years. Already in the 1900s, they had scorched earth, where they basically destroyed everything, and they took the Boer children and the Boer women and the elderly, and they put them into concentration camps, where they died in thousands. And after the war, there was a constant threat to the culture and the language of the Boers. For instance, my grandparents still relate to me, where they would speak English or Afrikaans in the schools. This was now after the Boer War and after the English once again took over South Africa. But when they, for instance, spoke Afrikaans in school, they would be given donkey ears to wear, and they would have to stand in the corner, things like that. But it was on a much grander scale. Even today, there's still this huge battle, ideological battle between English on the one hand, not per se now still more the British, and then the Afrikaner people trying to retain their culture and their language. So it's very interesting dichotomy. There's definitely two distinct racial groups among the white people also. There's of course there's also Portuguese and Greek people and Italian people and all these. But the two main racial groups, or the two main cultural groups within the white race in South Africa, are still Afrikaans and English, and to a certain extent there's still a divide between the two of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Schalk. It's actually quite scary these days because there's so few white people left that we really need to be holding our hands out to each other and getting over those differences in order to make one loud voice. But I don't think that's going to happen.
I don't think it will happen, Karin. And it's not only cultural and racial. It's also political and ideological. You would find that if an English person is conservative, he is very conservative. Yourself and the host, I think, are two very good examples of how conservative English-speaking people can be. But unfortunately, many of the English people through the decades were quite more liberal in their political thinking, and they belonged to different political parties. In the olden days, United Party, that later on evolved into what is today called the Democratic Alliance. And the Afrikaners were mostly ordered together into the Nationalist Party, the National Party. So even on the political face of it, there was this divide, and you still find it that staunch Afrikaners will speak about the bloody English liberals. So there's still this view of English people being, and it's not only a view, it's in practice too, more liberal in their way of thinking and dealing with politics in South Africa. Of course, Afrikaner people also swinged very far liberal after 94. I think to try and appease this whole issue of white guilt in South Africa, and apartheid guilt, and all those things. So many of the Afrikaners turned very far to the liberal side. Although at this point in time you see a large return of Afrikaners, and I think English people, speaking people too, to the more conservative fault of things.
So you started out by saying that there were no Africans, or what we consider, the noble black savage is what one thinks of finding in Africa. So there were none of those. There were only the Khoisan, little Bushmen-like orange people living in nomadic groups. So when did the Dutch East India Company's people meet up with the actual African black people?
That was only in the late 1800s and early late 1700s and early 1800s. You would find the wars being fought was never between the Dutch colonial empire and black people, the Xhosa people then on the Fish River. It was always the English people, the English colonial authority, which suggests to you that the first time that there were troubles between whites and blacks in South Africa could only have been after the English came in, and that is at the start of the 1800s. In the 1820s, a huge number of British settlers were also established in the Eastern Cape, for instance, to bolster the numbers of colonists there against the black colonists over the Fish River and the Kai River. So we're speaking about around the early 1800s that for the first time you had clashes and meeting between black colonists coming from the north and white colonists coming from the south. And it's very interesting to note the geographic tendencies here. The black people mostly moved in the areas where they could farm their cattle. They didn't go up onto the escarpment, which is cold and not as productive as the coastal areas. So you had the black people moving pretty much to the eastern side of the Great Drakensberg. It's a huge mountain series, basically cutting South Africa one-third to the east. So they were moving into that area all along the coast. They didn't live in the interior of South Africa. And you even find that in later years, during the voortrek, it was in the 1830s and 40s, the voortrekkers mostly went into the interior that was mostly depopulated. There was nobody living there. It was only in Transvaal where they started to encounter the Matibiles, and the Matibiles were also not from that area. They were basically Zulu people that fled in front of Schalk when he was establishing his empire in Natal. So if you look at the map of South Africa, you will find that the Drakensberg mountain was basically the furthest to the west that black people were living at that point in time. And the Kai River and the Fish River to the south, the first point south. The rest of South Africa was basically uninhabited. And that is why the voortrekker people and the trek boers moved into that area, because there was nobody living there. It's as simple as that.
So Schalk, we need to talk about the Zulu nation, because this is where the two meet up, but it wasn't at that time a Zulu nation, was it? It was an amalgamation of a ton of nations that had been annihilated, the remnants of African tribes that had been annihilated by the soon to be called the Zulus as they came south. Because that Mafekani or Mafekani, it killed, as far as we know, up to 1 million or more black people on their route south.
Yes, that's a fact. I can't vouch for the numbers. It's impossible to say how many black people, because there are simply no records of that. There were no written records. So we don't know how many people, black people executed and genocided during that stage. But there were two periods called the Mexican and the Defican. Those are black African words. It's not even Afrikaans words. We didn't think it out. They told us about it. During which the nation, what is today called the Zulu nation, was established. Now, what is a Zulu? A Zulu is basically just the northern part of the Nguni tribes living in Natal today, whereas the southern tribes are called Xhosa people and Tembu people. So what happened was that during the early 1800s, he was first just a chieftain, Shaka Zulu. He started to establish a kingdom for himself, and later on the kingdom became a few kingdoms, and very later, or at some stage, he decided he wanted to have an empire, and he established a Zulu empire, basically in what is today called Northern Natal, north of the Tugela River in Natal. And in that process, he displaced a huge amount of people living in those areas. Black on black genocide, nothing more than that. He cleared basically the whole of Natal between the Umzimvubu River, if I remember correctly, to the south, where the Transkei started in the olden days, and to the Tugela River in the north. He opened up a whole buffer between himself and the southern Nguni tribes, in which he literally killed off everything. Man, women, child, didn't matter. He basically killed them off, and those people that he didn't kill off, they started to move into the Drakensberg and later on into the escarpment of South Africa. So this empire building by Shaka Zulu basically displaced all these people from where they were living in the coastal areas of Natal and Swaziland and these areas back into the interior of South Africa. The Tswana people, for instance, their country of origin is still today Botswana. If you go and look at the map of South Africa, that is, they lived in Botswana. They didn't live in what is today called South Africa. And they were never in contact really with the Zulus. But those people displaced by the Zulus from the coastal areas, they later on ended up in the interior. And that is for instance, where the Sotho nation comes from. The Sotho nation was only established in the 1840s and 1850s. Now today they claim to be the original people living in the Free State, in what is today the Free State province. It was previously the Republic of the old Orange Free State. But they only came into existence after the Meshikane. They were only gathered by the King Meshweshwe during the 1840s and 50s. Now, 1850, it must ring a bell for you. The Afrikaners were there already for 200 years. My family came in the 1660s. We predate the Zulus by 150 years. Me, myself, the Afrikaner, the Van der Merwe people, the Van der Merwe family, we predate the Zulus. We predate the Xhosa people in the Sotho people in South Africa by 200 years. So this notion of black nations living and white people coming and taking their land, it's nonsensical. It's an absolute lie. It never happened. You find that the kingdom that is still today the kingdom of Lesotho, it was later on a protectorate under the British Crown. That is where the Sotho people lived. They didn't live in the Free State. They lived in Lesotho, in Basotho land. That is where they lived. Swaziland, well, that was where the Swazi people lived, and so forth and so on. So this notion of the whole of South Africa being a black country and whites coming and taking the land and genociding people, that's pure nonsense. It simply never happened.
So, okay, so now the Boers are fed up with the loose living and loose morals of the British, and fed up with being literally their government taken over by these people, and they decide to jump in their wagons and off they're going to go and find a better place to live where they can live free, speak their own language, worship their own God, their own way, etc. And off they go in small parties. And then what happened?
Yeah, that was what in later years was called the Great Trek. mostly from the northeastern part of the Cape Colony. The Cape Colony at that stage, the northern border was the Orange River, and the Eastern Cape. In those areas, there was quite an amount of animosity between the British colonial authority and the Boer people living there. And then by the 1830s, there was a mass migration of those people over the border of the Cape Colony, the Orange River. It was not called the Orange River at that stage. It was called the Gariep River. It was only later on called the Orange River in recognition of the Prince of Orange, being Dutch. But they started to move into that area away from the British colonial empire, because they wanted to be free and they didn't want to be at war constantly with the Xhosa people on the east border of the Cape Colony. So they started moving into the interior and started establishing republics, and those republics later on amalgamated to two big republics, which was the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek, which was basically the old Transvaal, and the Republic of the Orange Free State, which is still today the Free State province. I live in the Free State province. I'm a very proud Free Stater.
Well, the Schalk, you skipped over a good long period of time.
I'm covering all the bases tonight. We can go into all those little small interesting details when we get there. But that's basically what happened. The Trek Boers basically moved away from the Cape under the Dutch colonial rule, and then during the early 1800s until the mid 1800s, the Voortrekkers, the Great Trek took place, in which there was a mass migration of poor people into the interior of South Africa, and that is where the republics also came from. In Natal, for instance, many of your listeners will probably know that the Battle of Blood River and everything surrounding that. But that was also just part of the Great Trek, in which certain of these Boers started to move over the Drakensberg and into Natal, which was depopulated at that stage. Remember what I said earlier about Schalk clearing basically everything south of the Tugela? It was depopulated. That is why they started to move into what was later on called the Natal province, or the Natal, the Republic of Natalia. And they made treaties with the king, the Zulu king, Dingaan, at that stage. Once again, there's at the beginning of the Great Trek, you don't find wars between the Boer people and the blacks living in the interior. They moved in freely, and they moved in peacefully into those areas. It was only later on that they became a power struggle between, for instance, Dingaan and the Zulus against the Voortrekker people. In the interior, the Matabele people and the Voortrekkers. Because the trekkers were basically moving into virgin country, empty country, just to get away from the British authorities.
So, Schalk, is there... I've never really understood the Pitratif. It was Pitratif and his guys who went to see Dingaan to sign a treaty to occupy some land. Now, why was there necessity to get his permission to have a piece of land? I've never really understood that, because he didn't own it.
He didn't own it, but you must think of this in a very practical way. When the Voortrekkers started moving into that part of Natal, the Zulu kingdom was there, and it was very, very strong. And I think the Trek leaders realized that they would have to live in peace with the Zulu kingdom if they wanted to establish a republic there. And that is why they started to trade with the Zulus and building liaison and better relations with them, and later on sending Pitratif. He was supposed to go and fetch certain cattle that was stolen by one of the other chiefs that the problem with the Zulus and Dingaan running basically the whole of northern Natal. So he was doing a favor to Dingaan, to wish to get his favor, to win over his good favor. But it's mostly a practical. I think it was a practical consideration from the Trekker people to realize that there's this vast part of what is now what would have been called the Republic of Natalia some years later. But to the north, there's this huge, very, very strong Zulu empire that you simply can't think away. You must make peace with them in some way. You must live as good neighbors with them. Otherwise, you end up with exactly the same problem that you try to leave back in the Eastern Cape when you moved away from the Xhosa people.
So basically, it was a political maneuver in a lot of ways, that they felt that if they curried favor with Dingaan, they could kind of negotiate a peace treaty and live peacefully on whatever land he allowed them to have.
Yes, definitely. And you must remember that the area south of the Tugela was normally still part of the Zulu Empire. It was the buffer zone between them and the southern Lagoonies, the Xhosa people to the south. So it's practical in terms that the trekkers moving into that area, making a treaty with Dingaan. And you must remember that before the Piet Retief murders, there were very, very good relationships between the trekker and the Zulu people. And after Dingaan, after his defeat, and the establishment of the Natal Republic by the Boers, once again there was a time of great peace between the Zulu people and the Boer people. They were not natural enemies of one another. It was simply, if you really go and look at the problem, I think it was a personal problem between Dingaan and Piet Retief. And that was where the whole thing flared up. But they were not natural enemies, the Boer people and the Voortrekkers. The Voortrekkers naturally were with the British colonial empire that started to then at that stage come through Port Natal and trying to take over the whole of Natal again.
Okay, that makes sense to me, because I've never really understood how they went to barter with him for a piece of land when he actually didn't own it. But it makes sense because the Zulus outnumbered them hugely, and it was way better to have a peace treaty. Yeah, that makes sense. It's totally a sensible way to do things, and I've never been able to say that the Boer were not sensible people. I mean,
they were looking for peace. They were looking for peace. We spoke about it at the. Yes, we spoke about it earlier, that you will always find this core thing about the Boer people. They never wanted war. They were always running away, not running away, but running away in the sense of not going to war. They would rather try to avert it. They would rather try and move, literally, leave everything they own and everything they are, leave it behind and move into the wild interior than to fight the British and the Xhosa people. And later on, you will find exactly the same. With the Xhosa people, with the Zulu people, and so forth. So there's this theme of rather trying to have the peaceful way and live in a peaceful manner with those that are your neighbors. It's still today in South Africa like that. You won't find white people, Afrikaner people climbing into their trucks and buckets and driving to black areas and going and bashing and killing black people. It doesn't exist. It's not in my frame and my view of things. You live in good neighborly order with the people around you. And that was exactly the same 200 years ago.
So before you could get onto the show, Merwe and I were talking about the meaning of apartheid. It's basically separateness. And so from the very beginning, when Jan van Riebeeck landed, all the Afrikaner people have wanted to do is to be separate, to be left alone, to live in peace, and to get on with their lives. So
exactly.
Given that whole history, then apartheid was not such, even though not invented by the Afrikaner or the Boer, invented by the English, it was not such a foreign thing for them, because all they wanted was to be left in peace. I mean, even at one stage, they were happy to hand over the gold fields and the diamond fields to the British in order to be left alone. They were willing to do that.
Exactly. Especially the diamond fields. That's very interesting history, and we can cover it in a later program maybe. But when the British came, and they started occupying areas held by the Free State, the old Orange Free State Republic. And they wanted war. They wanted to go to war with the Orange Free State. The Free State said, no, we don't want war. You take the diamond fields. We just want to be left in peace. We want to build our own moral republic. So at a huge expense to themselves, the Boers gave the diamond fields, the Campbell fields and the diamond fields and what is today Kimberley. They gave it to the British so that they could have peace. So you will find that. Let's quickly look at the whole thing of apartheid. What is today called apartheid? People think apartheid was a system in South Africa that lasted for hundreds of years. Now that's simply also not true. Under the British colonial rule, you had the separation of the races in South Africa, formal separation of the nations in South Africa. If you speak of the very notorious 1913 Land Act, in 1913, there were no Afrikaners running South Africa. It was part of the British Empire. It was just after the Boer War. It was during the era of the First World War in 1914. You had the rebellion taking place where the Boer people tried to once again throw off the British colonial rule from South Africa. So we were part of the British Empire. The 1913 Land Act didn't have anything to do with either the Boer Afrikaner people or, for that matter, the Nationalist Party later on of Dr. Verwoerd. It was a British colonial law separating whites from blacks and giving blacks certain areas specifically where they could live in peace, where white people could not even own land. So it was a making at that point in time of the British colonial empire. Later on, various of the laws that were reinforced by the apartheid laws were promulgated under the British colonial empire, under the Queen. The Queen signed them off, and the King of Britain signed them off. It was not Afrikaners that invented it. It was only after 1948, and specifically then after 1961, when we regained our independence, that we simply gave the system a name. We called it apartheid. Now, apartheid, it sounds like something very strange to the English ear, but apart simply means separate. And hate, it's not hate, H-A-T-E. It's the Afrikaans H-E-I-D, which simply means the state of. In other words, the state of being separate. That is what apartheid means. And you're quite right. It was not one race dominating the other. It was just simply races being apart. And what is also very interesting, and people seem to forget this, in 1913, with the 1913 Land Act, only a very small percentage of South Africa was given by the British to the black tribes. Especially under Verwoerd, those areas were expanded tremendously by buying up and even forcibly removing whites from areas to join those areas and amalgamate those areas into the homeland system. So you had Afrikaners giving their own land to the black people where they could go and settle in the homeland areas. And people forget that. Lesotho, the kingdom of Lesotho of today, what is that different from a homeland apartheid? It was part of the British protectorates. It is still today an independent nation, right smack a small little country in the heart of South Africa. What makes that different from the Transkei that was given independence by the apartheid government later on? It's exactly the same. But there's this distinction drawn between the hateful system of apartheid, and then everybody forgets that it was actually a British colonial system that even today it exists. Bechuanaland is still Bechuanaland. It's still Botswana today. Swaziland still exists. Lesotho, the old Lesotho land still exists from those areas on.
One of the stories that is spread about the white South Africans is that we gave the blacks terrible land where they couldn't farm and could never even exist.
Oh.
I think it was you that pointed out, if you put the rainfall map over the homeland map, you will see that we gave them the best, most arable land in South Africa, because the percentage of actually arable land is very small.
Yes, you can do that. Any American listener to your show tonight can take what is arable land in South Africa. You can get that map And you can presuppose it onto the land map of South Africa, and you will see that where the old territories of the homelands were, it was the best land of South Africa. The most watered part of South Africa. Remember, South Africa is basically a desert country. It's deserts. The Free State is a semi-desert. In America, you would call where I live a desert. We don't call it a desert because we're much tougher than you American guys. But the long and the short is the black people already lived in many of the areas that were the best watered and some of the best cultivatable land. And it was simply reinforced to them. So you will find that the best land were allocated to the homeland system. If you look at the western part of South Africa, the dry, arid parts, especially of the Old Cape Province and Northern Cape and the Free State, you don't find any black homelands there in the desert areas. See, if that story was true, you would have found a huge displacement and removal of people from where they lived in the better areas of South Africa into those deserts. You would find all the black people living in the Northern Cape, but they don't live there. There's about 1 million white and colored people living in the Northern Cape. So that's a total fallacy of this idea of people being dumped in areas and they were living there in great poverty, etc., etc. That never happened. That is simply not the truth.
Well, I mean, Schalk, if you look at KwaZulu-Natal today, that is still Zulu land. It's ruled by the Zulu land. And is that not the very, very best land in South Africa?
It's the very best land in South Africa. What's interesting, you must remember that after the fall of apartheid and the disbanding of the so-called homelands, they didn't disappear. All those areas that were traditionally the homeland areas are still today occupied by black people and owned by the kings and chieftains that were recognized under apartheid. They are still living there and they're still ruling those areas. And they're still getting extremely rich. The royal families in South Africa are so rich, it's unimaginable how much they own and they live in. People have this idea of very poor black South Africans, and that's a true reflection, because in the township areas and so forth, they are really living in poverty. You can never deny that. But you will also find that, for instance, these royal families, they live like royalty, literally. I think they are even in a better position than some of the European royalty, and they've always lived there. So these areas designated the poor or the bad parts of South Africa. Why are these people then still living there if it's so bad? I can tell you why, because it's the best parts of South Africa. It's the best farming areas. It's the best land. It's where you find the most water. That is why they are still living there.
So, Schalk, even under the new Rainbow Nation, we now have self-segregation, where the 13 or however many tribes there are still self-segregate. And the only people who are not allowed to are the white South Africans.
That's a fact. That's a fact. In the townships, you will find areas where only Zulu people live and areas where only Tswana people live. Look, they mix. Don't get this idea of this extreme exclusivity amongst the black people. But you will find that they still do that. The Zulu people still live in Natal. The Xhosa people still live in what is the old Transkei. The Sotho people now started moving into the Free State, but they still live in the eastern parts of the Free State and Xhosa and Witsishoek and those areas. They still live there. Julius Malema's tribes, the Pedis in the north, they still live in the areas that were originally the Pedi areas of the homelands. The Venda people are still there. So even now, it's about 30 years, 35 years after Grand Apartheid was abolished. The people haven't moved. There's a very good reason why they haven't moved, because they always lived there. This idea of people being moved around in huge numbers by apartheid is also nonsensical. It's where these people lived. It's their tribal areas. It is where they've always lived. It's their cultural homelands. And they will live there forever. You have a huge amount of urbanization in South Africa, but that is also a global trend. It's not a South African thing, in which certain areas, Western Cape, for instance, Cape Town, and areas in Gauteng province, what is today called Gauteng province, that's Pretoria and Johannesburg. You have a huge influx of people to those areas, but that's economic. It has nothing to do with politics. They go there to go and find work. But the tribal areas are still there. You can drive with me today to trust areas that are still run by the chieftains, and the chieftains came all the years from under apartheid and even before that.
So there are two things I want to ask about that, Schalk. So they still live in their tribal areas, but they don't own the land, do they? The chiefs own the land. That's the first.
The chieftains own the land. Yeah.
Yeah.
You must remember something. The concept of individual ownership of land is a European and Western thing. It was Dutch and later on English, but it's Western, it's European, the thing of a person owning land. In the African way of life, in the African culture, there is no such thing as individual and ownership of land. It's owned by a chieftain, and it's basically a feudal system. A chieftain would be in fiefs to a higher chieftain, and he would be in fiefdom to a king, and in return they get land for that. So the ordinary black South African living in the tribal areas have never owned land. They are simply living under these trust areas. It's mostly now in trust. And under their chieftains and kings.
But their cry is, without land ownership, there can be no economic freedom. So the two things do not make sense, Schalk. You're never going to own land in your homelands, ever, because it belongs to the chieftain. You have it on a 99-year lease or whatever. So it was never taken. It was never taken from them. Yes. So it's ridiculous, the whole thing. Without land ownership, we can't have economic freedom.
Karin, I'm going to throw two numbers at you, which makes this whole thing just one big of nonsense. There's 4,000 farms. I think you shared it today on your social media too. But it's a known fact that there's 4,000 farms that's owned by the state, by the government themselves. So if they really wanted to distribute land to the landless black people that's supposedly living in poverty because they don't have land, then why is the government not giving those 4,000 farms to these poor black people? But there's another figure that's even more mind-boggling. In the general market, where you can buy farmland, at any given time you will find 20 to 30,000 farms always in the marketplace. So if the government was really interested in giving land to black people, why have they not started buying out some of those farms in huge numbers and simply giving the land to the blacks? So it's a political thing. It's not about land, it's political. It's political placing to get people to hate white people, to make them the scapegoats, etc. And it's very easy just simply to use this whole issue of land.
Plus, Schalk, on top of that, the government owns a huge percentage of the land in South Africa.
Yes. Yes, that's a fact.
So then, if they took those 20 or 30,000 farms that are for sale, plus the 4,000 that are just sitting there idling, and gave them to these people, and then made some of the government land free, we would not need the threat to take away the few thousand white farms. Because it really
no,
is.
You don't have to.
By the day.
You don't have to. There's another number that you must also bear in mind. When apartheid came to an end, there was a formal act of parliament, a land restitution act. You can go and look that up for yourself. You know about it, Karin. And that, in terms of the land restitution act, certain areas that were taken from not only black people, but even from white people were restituted to them. It was given back to them. And in more than 90% of the cases, those areas and those farms were simply sold off to the people that received them back from the state, or they settled for monetary compensation for that. So in other words, the average black person in South Africa does not want land. He would rather sell it off or take money in lieu of it. So it's a basically you have about 1 million people belonging to the Economic Freedom what is Economic Freedom Front? Yes, EFF, and BLF. It's about 1 million people out of 50 million that's now running around and saying we want land. The vast majority of Black South Africans don't want land, and we can see it from the numbers and facts.
Yeah, absolutely, Schalk, because Orania had a land claim against it, and they settled for cash. Although there's nothing to say that there will not be another claim against them at some time in the future. But the land claim that was there, they settled for cash.
Yes. Yeah, I must just advise the program. I'm going to go offline now. Yeah. So, but Karin, yeah, that's what I want to short of all policy. Yeah.
Schalk, thank you very much for being on, and we'll see you again in a month.
Okay, thank you very much, Karin, and thank you very much for my time, yeah, and to produce and by yourself also. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Schalk. Lovely to meet you. We'll speak to you again.
Thank you, Val. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Was that useful, Mel?
Oh, I'm loving it. I love this stuff, South African history. And it's brilliant to hear is people out there who are educated and who do know the truth and who are able to communicate it. And it's lovely, like knowing what I know, having done my own research. Here comes someone who's got a university degree in law, very much from like one of the oldest Afrikaner families. Van der Merwe's are an institute. I mean, we even have a cultural joke about Van der Merwe.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything is a Van der Merwe's.
They're so ingrained into our culture in terms of comedy, So to hear him come and speak about these things that, we've been trying to articulate for so long in terms of how it really works, who was there first, about land ownership, about the attitudes of various people, and just how all of this is completely twisted to create this unbelievable situation that we now have in South Africa where, well, we don't need to run through the list of disasters. We've spoken about it plenty, but lovely to hear from such a educated man about this from an ancient, really old Boer family.
Yeah. And the thing for me is there are very few South Africans, and this is not blaming them in any way, but there are very few in South Africa willing to speak out. And so for me, the fact that he is a public figure and well known and is still prepared to stand up and tell the truth, for me, that is very almost heroic. He's not an unknown person in South Africa, and he stands up under his own name quite proudly saying who he is and tells the story. I just find it amazing that there are people like that with so much to lose and yet willing to do it.
Well, Karin, at the end of the day, there is nothing prouder to stand under the aegis of than truth.
Yeah.
And, even if you're in the minority of one, the truth is still the truth, and that's the side that I want to be on. And we've got to look at the facts. I mean, some of the stuff that he talks about is actually very well documented. People just don't bother to go and do the research for themselves. It's not like we're digging the stuff out of archives that nobody can access. This stuff is very well documented, available in the public domain. And if people want to piece the parts together for themselves, just spend a day or two going through Wikipedia and clicking on various things. You'll work it out for yourself. It's not rocket science, and you'll see how the manipulation is played out.
Yep, absolutely. And they can even go to my website. I have got tons of historical stuff on my website because I've tried to show where we came from and how we got to where we are. And please find a way out of this because I don't know the way out, and I'm trying to document that. So on my website, you will find a ton of historical facts, to cut through the lies. Because there are more lies than there are people who know the truth.
Tell us your website again, Karin.
RadioFreeSouthAfrica.com.
Brilliant. And guys, also please feel free to check out stop.southafricangenocide.org. That's the South African website out there trying to put out this information and dig deeper than perhaps most will, but really good to hear from Schalk and Merwe tonight. And thank you very much, Karin. It's been so wonderful to have you with us yet again. And we look forward to seeing you all probably the week after next with some more great guests, and looking forward to keeping this particular slot flowing with great information. So do stay tuned to Conscious Consumer Network, everybody. We have some great stuff coming up on Stop South African Genocide. On that note, I'm going to say good night. Karin, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Mel. I seem to have taken over. I'm sorry. I don't mean to stand on your toes.
I was so happy you did, because you know what? I'm normally the one having to drag this information out of people. I just got to coast along for the ride tonight. So you did a great job.
I really never want to step on your toes.
No, I loved it. I loved it. Honestly, that was great. You did a great job. Thank you for and carrying this one through. It was really great. You asked some very good questions, and in the end, I think we got as much as we needed to get from Schalk, and hopefully we'll have him back.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everybody. See you again. Take care. If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Mainstream media exists for the purposes of indoctrination and manipulation of public perception. The world of free and independent media is growing, and with the upsurge in information now available in the public domain, it has never been easier to access free and independent media. The exploration of this information resulted in an experimental project which would provide a fully supported space for researchers, whistleblowers, and seekers of all kinds to express themselves and educate the world. On the 1st of January 2015, Conscious Consumer Network was launched to the world. Nobody thought we would make it this far, but CCN is the longest running free and independent media network of its kind. CCN is a unique collaboration of hearts and souls, bringing you information from different perspectives to educate and inform. Since we started CCN, we have had only one desire: the pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world, and this has not changed. Having overcome many challenges over the last 2 years, CCN is here to stay, and we've got great things lined up for 2017. Help keep CCN on the air by supporting the 2017 Network Support Fund.